She stared at the headline, coffee cooling, heart oddly quiet. The kitchen was still half asleep, morning light slipping through the blinds in thin stripes. The coffee maker had already clicked itself off, leaving that faint, burnt warm smell that always reminded her of early workdays long past. On the table lay her tablet, face up, frozen on a headline that felt louder than the room itself. She didn't tap it right away. She just stared, the way people do when something unsettles them but hasn't yet earned their fear. Before anything else unfolds, it's worth saying this gently. This story is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's a story, not a prescription, and certainly not a verdict. She was 68, recently retired, and proud of how she'd settled into her mornings. Nothing fancy, coffee, toast, a short walk when the weather allowed. She liked that her life now moved at a human pace. But headlines don't care about pace. They arrive fast, sharp, and certain, as if clarity were something you could package in bold letters. The word that caught her wasn't doctor or even vegetable. It was shocked. Shocked always felt theatrical to her, like something meant for television rather than real life. Still, she noticed how her shoulders tightened anyway. That surprised her. She'd lived long enough to know better, hadn't she? She remembered her mother reading newspapers at the same table decades earlier, one finger tracing the columns as if they were roads on a map. Back then, health news felt slower, less personal somehow. Now it felt like it knew her name, her age, her quiet worries. It felt like it had followed her into retirement. She took a sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and noticed how the bitterness lingered longer than usual. Funny how the body reacts before the mind finishes its thought. She hadn't even opened the article, yet something in her had already shifted. Not fear exactly, more like a faint unease, the kind that hums just beneath awareness. What troubled her most wasn't the idea that a food could be harmful. She understood that bodies are complicated, that nothing is universally perfect. What troubled her was how quickly certainty was offered. Overnight, the headline promised, as if health were a light switch, flipped by a single bite taken too late in the day. She thought about the vegetable mentioned, one she'd eaten for years without ceremony. It had never felt dramatic. It had simply been there, chopped and stirred, part of meals shared with friends, with her late husband, with neighbors who dropped by unannounced. Food, to her, had always been a background actor, not a villain waiting for its close-up. A memory surfaced of a summer afternoon years ago, when her husband stood at the counter slicing that same vegetable, sunlight catching the knife just so. He'd been talking about nothing important. Or maybe it was everything important, disguised as nothing. She couldn't remember the words, only the feeling. Ordinary, safe, human. That was the first small crack the headline made, not fear of illness, but a sense of betrayal. As if something familiar had been recast without her consent. According to many studies, health doesn't usually unravel in dramatic leaps. It shifts quietly, influenced by patterns, habits, stress, sleep, movement, and yes, food, but rarely by one ingredient, acting alone. The body is less like a fragile glass and more like a woven fabric. Tug one thread too hard, and you feel it, but the whole cloth doesn't fall apart overnight. She knew this, at least intellectually. Still, she noticed how her mind began to bargain. Maybe she should stop eating it for a while, just to be safe. That phrase, just to be safe, has a way of sneaking into decisions, even when safety hasn't actually been threatened. She thought about her doctor, calm and methodical, never dramatic. He'd once told her that good health conversations are usually boring. They don't make headlines. They sound more like, let's keep an eye on this, or how have you been feeling lately? No shock, no urgency. Just time, doing what time does. What many people notice, especially as they get older, is that uncertainty feels heavier now than it used to. There's more to protect, more to lose. So when a bold claim appears, it presses on that tenderness. Not because it's true, but because it could be. She finally tapped the screen, not to read, but to close it. The tablet went dark, reflecting her own face back at her. She looked thoughtful, not frightened. Curious, not convinced. That felt like a small victory. Later that morning, she'd still eat breakfast, she'd still take her walk. Life, she suspected, would continue in its quiet way, regardless of headlines. And maybe that was the wisdom age offers, not certainty, but perspective. The ability to pause before panic, to notice the space between a claim and your own lived experience. As she stood to rinse her mug, she smiled faintly at the absurdity of it all. How something so ordinary could be framed as so powerful. How stories, when told loudly enough, can make us forget what we already know. Health, she believed, was less about avoiding every possible risk and more about learning how to live without constant alarm. Calm, she'd learned, was its own kind of nourishment. And, as the morning light grew stronger, she wondered not for the first time how many small choices are shaped by fear before we even realize it. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I used to feel good eating this, she whispered, half joking, half not. The word sat there longer than it should have. Risk. Not loud, not flashing, just printed neatly beneath a photo of a perfectly ordinary plate. She noticed how her eyes kept drifting back to it, as if it were magnetic. Funny how one word can change the temperature of a room without making a sound. By now, the house was fully awake. The refrigerator hummed its steady reassurance. Outside, a neighbor's car door slammed, followed by the soft echo of tires on pavement. Life was continuing at its dependable pace, even as something subtle shifted inside her. It wasn't panic. It was hesitation. And hesitation, she'd learned, has a way of sneaking into daily routines, quietly rearranging them. She stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for lunch later, movements practiced enough to require no thought, or at least, they used to. Today, her hand paused mid-slice. She looked down at the cutting board, at the familiar colors and textures, and felt an unexpected distance, as if the food were no longer neutral, as if it had acquired a personality overnight. This story, like the one before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about how ideas move through our lives, not about diagnosing or treating anything. She thought about how food memories form, the casseroles at church potlucks, the salads someone always brought because they were trying to be healthy, the quiet pride of choosing something green. None of those moments had ever involved fear. They involved belonging, comfort, a sense of doing one's best with the information available at the time. Now, the word risk hovered over those memories like a cloud that hadn't earned its rain. What struck her was how quickly her feelings changed, not because of a personal experience, but because of language. She hadn't felt different after eating the vegetable. Her body hadn't sent any alarm. Yet her perception had shifted, and perception, she realized, is powerful. It doesn't need evidence to influence behavior. It just needs repetition. A few years back, she'd noticed the same thing with other foods. One decade they were heroes, the next they were suspects. Butter, eggs, coffee. Each had taken turns wearing the label of concern. Each time, people adjusted, avoided, substituted, sometimes with relief, sometimes with resentment. And eventually, the noise moved on to something else. According to many studies, nutritional research often examines patterns over long periods, not single meals or isolated ingredients. But that nuance rarely survives the journey into everyday conversation. What survives is the emotional hook, the part that makes you pause mid-bite and wonder if you've been wrong all along. She caught herself imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet. A friend at lunch saying, "I stopped eating that. Didn't you hear?" She felt the faint social pressure of being out of step. Even in her own kitchen, it was strange how hypothetical judgment could feel so real. She remembered her sister calling years ago, convinced that a certain food was bad now. They'd laughed about it later, admitting neither could remember why they'd been so sure. Time had softened the certainty into something more reasonable. Moderation, awareness, balance. Words that don't trend well, but age gracefully. Standing there, knife resting on the board, she realized something quietly important. The discomfort she felt wasn't about health at all. It was about trust. Trust in her own habits. Trust in what had sustained her without drama for decades. Trust erodes not with facts, but with doubt, repeated often enough. The body, she reflected, is not a courtroom where one word convicts. It's more like a long conversation. It responds to tone, consistency, and care. It listens over time. She finished chopping and slid the vegetables into a container, sealing it with a soft click. The sound felt grounding, practical, real. Whatever the headlines said, lunch would still happen. Her body would still do what bodies do: digest, adapt, continue. Later, she sat down and wrote a grocery list. She hesitated briefly, pen hovering, then wrote the item anyway, not defiantly, just calmly, as if to say, "I'm still paying attention, but I'm not panicking." That felt like wisdom, or at least the beginning of it. The ability to hold new information without letting it rewrite your entire story. In one stroke, she folded the list and slipped it into her purse, feeling lighter than she had an hour earlier. The word risk hadn't disappeared, but it had lost some of its authority. It was just a word again, one among many, and as she rinsed her hands at the sink, watching the water carry away stray bits of green, she wondered how often our choices change not because of what we feel, but because of what we're told to fear. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? "It's just a vegetable," he said, like that should settle everything. The grocery store was cool and bright, the kind of place where time stretches a little. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and clean floors. She pushed her cart slowly, as she liked to do now, giving herself permission not to rush. Retired life had taught her that speed was rarely a requirement, even when the world insisted otherwise. She stopped in front of the produce section, where rows of vegetables stood in tidy abundance. Colors stacked like a painter's palette, greens deep and pale, reds polished to a shine, yellows warm as late afternoon. This was the same section she'd walked through for decades, yet today it felt slightly different, as if one item had stepped forward under an invisible spotlight. This story, like the chapters before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about noticing how meaning gets assigned, not about declaring foods good or bad. Her neighbor had joined her that morning, mostly for company. He stood beside her now, hands resting on the cart handle, peering at the display with mild confusion. "It's just a vegetable," he repeated, shrugging. He wasn't dismissive. He was practical. The kind of man who believed common sense still had a place in daily life. She almost agreed out loud. Almost. But something held her back. Because it wasn't just a vegetable anymore, not in the way it had been. It had become a symbol, a placeholder for bigger questions about control, aging, and whether the rules had quietly changed without anyone bothering to explain them fully. She picked one up, feeling its weight in her hand. Cool. Solid. Unremarkable. It didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel powerful. It felt like food. That realization brought a surprising sense of relief. She remembered buying the same vegetable years ago for her children, slicing it thin so they wouldn't complain. She remembered sauces, soups, holidays where it disappeared into recipes without comment. Back then, it hadn't carried a reputation. It had simply played its part. What many people notice over time is that foods don't change nearly as often as the stories we tell about them. The vegetable in her hand was the same as it had been. What had changed was the narrative wrapped around it. According to many studies, nutrition science evolves slowly, building understanding piece by piece, but public perception moves fast, jumping from conclusion to conclusion, hungry for certainty. It's easier to point to a single item and say, "There, that's the problem," than to sit with the messier truth that health is shaped by patterns and context. Her neighbor wandered off toward the apples, already finished with the conversation. She stayed a moment longer, watching other shoppers. Some moved with purpose, grabbing items without hesitation. Others lingered, phones in hand, double-checking labels, searching for reassurance. She recognized herself in both. A thought surfaced, quiet but steady. Maybe the problem isn't the vegetable at all. Maybe it's what happens when we expect food to carry moral weight. When eating becomes a test you can fail instead of a routine meant to sustain you. She placed the vegetable into her cart. The sound it made, a soft thud against the metal, felt strangely decisive. Not rebellious, not careless, just intentional. As she moved on, she reflected on how easily we outsource our confidence. A headline speaks, and suddenly we doubt years of lived experience. It's not stupidity, she realized. It's vulnerability. Aging teaches you that your body matters, and when something matters, you listen closely to anyone who claims to understand it. She paused near the end of the aisle, adjusting her list. The store smelled faintly of bread now, warm and reassuring, ordinary life asserting itself again. The truth, as she saw it, was simpler than the story suggested. No single vegetable had ever defined her health. What defined it were mornings like this, walking, choosing, paying attention without surrendering calm. She smiled to herself, thinking how strange it was that abundance could feel threatening if framed the wrong way. How choice could feel like danger instead of freedom. At the checkout, the cashier scanned her items without comment. No alarms sounded. No warnings appeared. The world remained intact. And as she wheeled her cart toward the exit, sunlight spilling through the automatic doors, she wondered how many things we've learned to fear simply because someone told us they mattered more than they do. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? Did you hear what they're saying about that now? Ein quote. And every pause. The question arrived halfway through the sentence, clipped and unfinished, like a secret passed too quickly. They were sitting at a small cafe near the park, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that never quite changed. Late morning, sunlight spilled across the table, catching the steam rising from their cups. This story, as always, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It lives in conversations and observations, not diagnoses. She looked up from her coffee to see her friend leaning in, voice lowered, as if the vegetable itself might be listening. There was concern there, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even a hint of excitement. Health news, she'd noticed, often traveled like gossip. Not cruel, exactly. Just eager. What are they saying, she asked, though part of her already knew. The pattern had become familiar. Her friend waved a hand, searching for the right words. You know. Doctors, studies, overnight stuff. The details blurred together, but the emotion landed clearly. Uncertainty wrapped in urgency. Around them, the cafe hummed with ordinary life. A couple argued gently over which pastry to share. Someone laughed, too loudly, at a nearby table. Outside, a man walked his dog, pausing to let it sniff the same patch of grass with deep concentration. None of them seemed aware of the quiet alarm being discussed inside. She listened, nodding, noticing how the conversation skipped over specifics and lingered on tone, shocked. Risky. Should we stop eating it? These were not questions as much as invitations to worry, to align, to agree that something had shifted. What many people notice in moments like this is how quickly doubt spreads when it's shared. Alone, a headline can be dismissed. Spoken aloud, it gains weight. It becomes social. To disagree feels almost rude. She took a sip of coffee, buying herself time. The bitterness grounded her. I've been thinking about that, she said slowly. Not agreeing, not dismissing, just acknowledging. Her friend exhaled, relieved. Right? I mean, you try to do everything right, and then suddenly, she trailed off, shaking her head. The sentence didn't need an ending. It carried a lifetime of effort inside it. According to many studies, stress and worry themselves can shape how we experience our bodies, not as causes or cures, but as influences like background noise that changes the way everything else sounds. Sitting there, she wondered how many health scares were amplified not by evidence, but by echo. She remembered conversations from years ago. Different topics, same rhythm. Someone heard something. Someone else confirmed it. Soon it felt irresponsible not to react. The fear wasn't sharp. It was communal, soft-edged, harder to resist. A fragment of dialogue from another table drifted over. My doctor said. It hung there, incomplete, but powerful. Doctors, when unnamed and unheard, become symbols more than people. She leaned back in her chair and watched a leaf tumble past the window, caught briefly in a gust before settling again. That felt like a metaphor she didn't need to explain. I think, she said carefully, sometimes we forget how much context matters. She spoke from experience, not authority. From years of noticing how certainty ages poorly. Her friend tilted her head, considering. So you're not worried? She paused. Honesty mattered. I'm paying attention, she said, but I'm not panicking. The word panicking landed gently between them. Not accusatory, just descriptive. Her friend smiled, a little sheepish. That's probably healthier, she admitted. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the cafe breathe. The conversation had shifted, not because the information changed, but because the temperature did. Calm had entered the room. She thought about how often reassurance comes not from answers, but from tone, from someone choosing steadiness, when alarm would be easier. As they stood to leave, her friend laughed softly. Next week, it'll be something else, she said. Usually is, she replied, smiling. Walking out into the sunlight, she felt lighter, not because the question was resolved, but because it had been shared without escalating. That felt like progress of a quiet sort, and as they parted ways, she wondered how many of our fears begin as fragments half heard, half understood, and grow simply because we repeat them. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? Shocked is a word that travels faster than the truth. She heard it again that afternoon, this time from the television in the background. Not the details, just the tone. Raised eyebrows, dramatic pauses, the familiar cadence of urgency. She wasn't even watching, yet the word reached her, floating through the room like a siren that didn't quite demand attention but refused to be ignored. This story continues to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about how messages are framed, not about what anyone should or shouldn't do. She muted the TV and sat down, noticing how quickly the silence felt kinder. It occurred to her that she'd never once heard her own doctor use that word. Not in years of appointments, not when discussing test results, medications, or changes that actually mattered. Shocked belonged to another world, a louder one. In real life, doctors had always spoken to her in measured sentences. They asked questions. They listened. They used phrases like, "Let's monitor this," or "It might be worth adjusting." Even when the news wasn't great, it came wrapped in calm. In time, so why did everything online sound like a medical emergency? What many people notice, once they start paying attention, is that online health stories often perform emotion rather than convey understanding. The goal isn't clarity, it's attention. And nothing grabs attention like the suggestion that something ordinary has suddenly become dangerous. According to many studies, dramatic framing increases engagement, even when the underlying information is modest. It's not deception, exactly, it's amplification. A small signal turned up too loud. She thought back to a visit years ago, when she'd asked her doctor about a food she'd read about. He'd smiled, not dismissively, but kindly. "Context matters," he'd said, "and so does the rest of your life." At the time, she hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now, it made perfect sense. Health, she realized, is rarely shocking when you're actually living it. It's incremental, subtle. Changes show up slowly, like seasons, not like lightning strikes. The idea that doctors everywhere were suddenly stunned by a single vegetable felt theatrical, as if an entire profession had gasped in unison overnight. She pictured it and almost laughed. Not because health isn't serious, but because the image was so far from reality. She remembered how her father used to say that if someone wanted your attention, they'd raise their voice. If they wanted your trust, they'd lower it. That felt relevant now. Sitting there, she noticed how her own body responded to calmer thoughts. Her shoulders softened, her breathing slowed. Nothing external had changed, just the story she was telling herself. She turned the TV back on, volume low this time, more out of curiosity than concern. The segment moved on quickly, as these things always do. Another headline, another urgency, the previous one already forgotten, replaced by the next thing viewers were meant to worry about. That, she thought, was the most revealing part. If something truly demanded immediate action, would it vanish so quickly from the screen? The vegetable in question had been eaten by millions of people for generations. That didn't make it perfect, but it did make the idea of sudden universal shock feel improbable. Bodies adapt, cultures learn, science refines. Rarely does everything flip overnight. She stood up and opened a window, letting in fresh air. The neighborhood sounded the same as it had all morning. Birds, a lawnmower in the distance, normal life, uninterested in headlines. What comforted her most was realizing that calm wasn't ignorance. It was discernment, the ability to separate volume from value. She thought again of her doctor, of the steady way he spoke, of how he never rushed her out the door. That was the voice she trusted, not the one shouting from a screen. As the afternoon light shifted across the room, she felt a quiet confidence return. Not certainty, she'd learned better than that, but balance. A sense that she didn't need to react to every alarm to be responsible. And in that stillness, she wondered how often we confuse urgency with importance, simply because one is louder than the other. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? Overnight always sounded like a dare to believe too much. She heard that word and felt her brow crease before she even realized why. Overnight, it suggested speed, immediacy, a sudden turn in the road with no warning signs. It implied that yesterday's habits were safe, and today's were reckless. That kind of shift didn't match her experience of life or her body. This story, like the ones before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about understanding rhythm, not predicting outcomes. She thought about her old car, the one she'd driven for nearly 15 years. It never broke down overnight. It gave signals, a rattle here, a hesitation there, little messages that something needed attention long before anything actually failed. Bodies, she believed, worked much the same way. According to many studies, changes in health usually unfold gradually, influenced by long-term patterns rather than single moments. That idea had always comforted her. It meant there was room to notice, to adjust, to respond without panic. The overnight narrative, on the other hand, left no room for reflection. It demanded reaction. Eat this today, and tomorrow everything changes. It was a story built for clicks, not for real people who live inside real bodies. She sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where this journey had started days earlier. A bowl of soup steamed gently in front of her. She ate slowly, aware of texture, warmth, taste. Nothing dramatic happened. Her body accepted the food the way it always had, quietly and without commentary. What many people notice as they age is that their relationship with time deepens. They've seen trends rise and fall. They've watched fears flare and fade. Overnight claims feel different when you've lived through decades of sudden revelations that turned out to be temporary. She remembered a period when everyone was afraid of salt, then sugar, then fat. Each wave arrived with urgency, each promising clarity, and each, eventually, softened into something more reasonable. Nuance doesn't make headlines, but it endures. The body, she reflected, is not a light switch. It's more like a dimmer, responding to consistency rather than extremes. It notices what you do most days, not what you do once. She thought about the people she knew who lived long, steady lives. None of them chased every new rule. They ate, moved, rested, worried sometimes, laughed often. They paid attention, but they didn't obsess. There was wisdom in that. Later, she went for her afternoon walk. The sidewalk was uneven in places, cracked by years of weather and roots pushing up from below. Progress didn't erase the past. It adapted around it. That felt like another metaphor she didn't need to force. As she walked, she breathed deeply, feeling her legs move in a rhythm that belonged to her alone. No overnight transformation, just continuity. The idea that a single vegetable could flip a switch overnight now felt almost comical, not insulting, just oversimplified. Health, she understood, was complex precisely because it was alive. She paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change, watching cars pass. Engines didn't fail the moment one wrong turn was made. They responded to maintenance over time. Neglect mattered. Care mattered. Patterns mattered. When she returned home, she felt tired in a good way. The kind of tiredness that comes from living, not worrying. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the sink, thinking how tempting overnight promises are. They offer certainty in a world that rarely provides it. But they also rob us of patience. And patience, she'd learned, was one of the quiet pillars of well-being. As evening settled in, she felt grateful for slowness, for the chance to notice instead of react, for the understanding that most meaningful changes arrive gradually, giving us time to adjust. And as she turned off the kitchen light, she wondered why we're so willing to believe in sudden danger, but so reluctant to trust in steady care. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? According to studies, she read, wondering which ones they meant. The phrase appeared again on her screen, polite and authoritative, as if that alone should settle the matter. According to studies, plural, vague, comforting in its own way. She noticed how often it showed up without explanation, like a stamp of approval pressed onto a sentence that didn't quite stand on its own. This story continues to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about how information is interpreted, not how anyone should treat their body. She set her tablet down and leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, a gardener across the street was working methodically, kneeling, standing, adjusting the soil a little at a time. No single motion changed the garden. It was the accumulation that mattered. According to many studies, real ones, careful ones, nutrition research tends to look at large groups of people over long periods. It observes patterns, not destinies, tendencies, not guarantees. That distinction often gets lost somewhere between the journal and the headline. She remembered once hearing a scientist speak on the radio. He'd sounded almost apologetic, explaining that findings are usually modest. We rarely discover something that changes everything, he'd said. We refine what we already suspect. That humility had stayed with her. What many people notice, though, is that modesty doesn't travel well. It's too quiet. It doesn't demand action. So the nuance gets shaved away, leaving behind something sharper, simpler, easier to share. She thought about how statistics work, at least in the broad sense. Groups, averages, probabilities. Useful for understanding trends, less useful for predicting individual outcomes. Her life, after all, wasn't an average. It was specific. It had its own rhythms, habits, and history. The studies people referenced rarely asked about her morning walks, her friendships, her sleep, her grief, her laughter. They couldn't. Research needs boundaries. Life does not. She found comfort in that idea. Science, at its best, was a tool, not a verdict. It offered clues, not commands. Later that day, she met her daughter for lunch. They talked about work, about a neighbor's new dog, about nothing particularly important. At one point, her daughter mentioned seeing something online about food and health, rolling her eyes slightly. It changes every week, she said. She smiled. It feels faster now, she replied. But maybe we're just more aware of it. They ate, unhurried. The conversation drifted. No one mentioned studies again. According to many studies, stress and enjoyment both shape how we experience our bodies. Sitting there, she suspected that the ease of the moment mattered as much as anything on the plate. She thought again of the gardener outside her window. How absurd it would be to judge the health of a garden after one afternoon. You watch it through seasons. You notice what thrives, what struggles, and you adjust. Health, she believed, asked for the same patience. That evening, she returned to her tablet, not to search for more answers, but to read a novel. Fiction, she learned, had a way of reminding her that life is layered, not linear. That certainty is rare, and that's okay. As she turned the page, she felt a quiet respect for science, paired with an equally quiet respect for lived experience. One informed the other, neither replaced it, and before sleep, she wondered how different our days might feel if we treated studies as guides instead of alarms. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? So this is the bad one now? The question came out lighter than she felt, tossed into the air during dinner with friends. Someone laughed. Someone else shrugged. The table moved on, but the idea lingered, hovering just above the conversation like steam that refused to fully disappear. This story remains meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about how blame takes shape, not about declaring enemies. She noticed how easily the group had accepted the premise that there must be one thing, one ingredient, one habit, one choice that tipped the balance. There was comfort in that simplicity. That, he can differ to see. 173. If you could point to a single culprit, you could imagine control returning just as neatly. She'd seen this pattern before. Not just with food, but with everything. When something feels uncertain, people look for a villain. It makes the story easier to tell. It gives anxiety a place to land. What many people notice, especially over time, is that health rarely cooperates with such tidy narratives. It behaves more like a mosaic than a straight line. Many small pieces, arranged slowly, some visible, others hidden. According to many studies, outcomes are usually influenced by clusters of factors: environment, habits, stress, genetics, time. Pulling one thread doesn't unravel the whole tapestry. But that's harder to explain than a single headline. She thought about how food had become moralized over the years. Good, bad, clean, dirty. Words that belonged more to judgment than nourishment. When did eating turn into a test of character? She remembered her grandmother's table, heavy with dishes that would raise eyebrows today. No one counted anything back then. They ate, talked, argued, forgave. People lived long lives not because they avoided every supposed villain, but because they were anchored in routine and community. At the dinner table now, plates were cleared, dessert debated. The bad one had already lost its moment, replaced by a story about a vacation mishap. That, she realized, was how quickly villains fade when life asserts itself. Later, washing dishes, she reflected on how seductive the idea of a single cause can be. It promises certainty. If this one thing is the problem, then avoiding it feels like progress. But it also shrinks the world, turning abundance into a minefield. She dried her hands and leaned against the counter, thinking how often people confuse focus with truth. Focusing on one thing doesn't mean it matters more than the rest. The body, she believed, doesn't keep score the way headlines do. It responds to patterns, to how often you move, how deeply you rest, how connected you feel, how consistently you eat, not whether one vegetable was crowned a villain last week. She caught herself smiling at the absurdity of it all. How something grown in soil could be asked to carry so much blame. There was a quiet freedom in letting go of villains. In accepting that health isn't a mystery to be solved once, but a relationship to be tended. As the kitchen lights dimmed and the house settled into evening, she felt lighter for having named it, even if only to herself. The problem wasn't the vegetable. It was the story being told about it. And as she headed to bed, she wondered how many of our worries would loosen their grip if we stopped asking for villains and started paying attention to patterns. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I barely noticed I was tired, he said, almost embarrassed. The words slipped out during a quiet Sunday morning coffee, shared between old friends on a worn porch swing. The wind ruffled the chimes above, carrying soft, rhythmic notes that seemed to echo the unspoken acknowledgement. Life had changed, slowly, in ways you only noticed in fleeting moments. This story, like the chapters before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about noticing patterns, not labeling outcomes. He stared at the mug in his hands, watching the steam rise and dissipate, and reflected on how subtle fatigue had crept in over the years. Not dramatic, not alarming, just a low hum of weariness that whispered, "Pay attention." She recognized it, too. She had felt it herself, mornings stretching longer than they used to, afternoons that demanded a pause, evenings when the world seemed heavier. What many people notice is that energy ebbs quietly before the body signals anything obvious. It's not a crash, it's a drift. The kind of change you might miss if you're not paying attention to small cues. According to many studies, physical and cognitive vitality in seniors often correlates with patterns of rest, movement, and nutrition over time. Not single interventions, not instant fixes. It's the consistency of small habits, the walks, the stretches, the mindful meals that shapes the way the body carries its years. He leaned back, smiling faintly, thinking about a car he had once owned. Small maintenance, regular oil changes, careful driving, they didn't prevent age, but they kept the engine running smoothly for decades. Life worked in the same way. Energy could be preserved, even improved slightly, through attention to consistent, gentle care. He ends say, without Ringelov. Energy could be say, without Ringelov, without Ringelov, without Ringelov. without Ringalov, without Ringalov, without Ringalov, without. She remembered her own subtle shifts in energy over the years. Waking earlier without exhaustion, noticing that one extra block of walking felt different than it had a decade ago, recognizing that stretching in the morning reduced stiffness in the afternoon. Small, seemingly insignificant actions had cumulative effects. They weren't headlines, but they were real. Later, they walked together through the park. He pointed out the pigeons picking at the ground and laughed at their persistence. She noticed the trees, shedding leaves slowly in preparation for winter, each one following its own rhythm, yet forming part of a bigger, predictable cycle. Small actions mattered, rest mattered, observation mattered. And yet, in everyday conversation, these truths were often overshadowed by dramatic claims, overnight risk, shocking news, instant danger. She thought about her neighbor, who had recently begun taking short walks after years of sedentary habits. Each day, a little longer. Each day, a little easier. No overnight transformation. No sudden revelation, just progress quietly accumulating. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat on the porch swing again, letting the cool air wash over them. Fatigue remained, but it felt manageable, softened by awareness and care. It was the subtle, patient acknowledgement that life moved in patterns rather than leaps. And as the crickets began their evening chorus, she wondered how often we underestimate the power of small, consistent choices to shift everything over time. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I touched it and felt nothing, she murmured, staring at the leafy pile on the counter. The words lingered, almost a confession. It was a simple gesture, her fingers brushing the vegetable she had debated over all week. But it felt like a small test, a measurement of courage more than curiosity. The kitchen smelled faintly of herbs, the sunlight coming through the window, catching specks of dust in the air, highlighting the calm domesticity that contrasted sharply with the headlines she had read. This story, like the ones before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It's about noticing how perception shapes action, not about making declarations of right or wrong. She picked it up, feeling the familiar texture, the cool firmness. It was, in truth, unremarkable, ordinary, safe. And yet, she realized, her hesitation spoke louder than her senses. Our bodies, she reflected, often know what's real long before our minds catch up with the stories we've heard. According to many studies, perception can influence behavior more than immediate evidence. Anxiety, expectation, and cultural narratives create invisible filters over ordinary experiences. In other words, what we think about something can matter as much as what is actually true. She recalled a gardening analogy her father once shared. Plants thrive not because they are scolded or lectured, but because they are nurtured steadily over time, watered, pruned, given sun, given rest. Care accumulates, neglect accumulates. Rarely does a single day determine the outcome. Health, she thought, worked the same way. What many people notice is that daily choices, even minor ones, quietly add up. A short walk in the morning, a mindful meal, a gentle stretch before bed, small adjustments that feel insignificant in isolation. Yet, over time, their effect is profound. She set the vegetable down, chopping board in front of her, and decided to prepare it for lunch. She added it to a medley of familiar ingredients, each chosen more for comfort and satisfaction than for headlines. The act of preparing food became a ritual of reassurance, a gentle claim on her own agency. Later, she took a brief walk around her neighborhood, the sun warm on her shoulders, the sidewalks cracked but familiar. Children played at the end of the street. A dog barked at a squirrel. Life continued its quiet insistence. The vegetable, the headlines, the whispers of risk, they had not altered this world. She realized that small habits, walking, stretching, sharing meals, savoring flavors, were like tending a garden. They didn't produce instant blooms, but they created the conditions for resilience. She felt empowered in the ordinary, noticing the subtle strength that comes from consistency rather than drama. Returning to the kitchen, she plated the meal carefully. Steam rose in soft tendrils. Each bite was deliberate, each taste a reminder that she had control over her actions, even if she couldn't control every claim or story floating in the world. And as she sat down to eat, watching sunlight shift across the counter, She reflected on how often hesitation can be replaced with gentle action and how those actions, repeated over time, quietly shift everything. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I never realized it could feel so heavy, just holding it. The sentence escaped her lips, almost without thought, as she lifted the vegetable from the basket. Its weight surprised her not in pounds or ounces, but in the strange sense of responsibility it now seemed to carry. The kitchen smelled faintly of citrus and morning coffee, sunlight streaming through the blinds in stripes across the counter. She paused, placing it down gently, as if it were fragile. This story, as always, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is a reflection on perception, habits, and the quiet accumulation of choices that shape life over decades. She leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. The headlines had been loud lately. Words like shocked, risk, overnight had surrounded this unassuming vegetable, giving it an almost mythical significance. And yet here it was, ordinary in every tangible way. The weight she felt was not physical. It was the weight of information, of years of accumulated advice, warnings, and cautionary tales. It was the gravity of expectation. Her mind wandered to the mornings when she had first started cooking for herself and her family decades ago. The kitchen had smelled of sizzling onions, garlic, bread, baking in the oven. She had learned then that food carried more than nutrients. It carried comfort, ritual, connection. That lesson had remained, even as the world's messaging about health grew louder, faster, and sometimes frightening. According to many studies, the human body is remarkably resilient, adapting to patterns over time rather than reacting dramatically to isolated events. What shapes vitality is the accumulation of small habits: movement, hydration, balanced meals, sleep, not the sudden avoidance of a single item. Yet, she noticed, the media often treated each new report as if it were a switch that could flip life upside down. She thought about Mr. Thompson, her neighbor, who had recently taken up morning walks after decades of sedentary life. One day, he admitted that he felt slower, but also lighter, more deliberate in his steps. He didn't notice the difference overnight. It had been months, but gradually, his stamina returned. That quiet, steady progress reminded her of how patterns mattered far more than panic. Later, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down observations, not plans. She recorded how her body felt after breakfast, how her energy shifted through the morning, the small moments of tension or ease in her muscles. She wrote not to diagnose or to predict, but to notice. She realized that paying attention, truly paying attention, was a form of empowerment. It didn't need to be loud to matter. What many people notice as they grow older is that small, consistent actions quietly compound. A brief stretch each morning, a walk around the block, savoring meals without distraction. These weren't dramatic, headline-worthy solutions, but they produced tangible results over time. They were the slow rhythm that life demanded, unnoticed until one day, reflection revealed the change. The sun shifted through the window, brushing her notebook in warm light. Outside, children ran through fallen leaves, their laughter a gentle percussion against the occasional bark of a dog. She closed her eyes briefly and imagined her own body as part of that same rhythm. Flexible, responsive, alive. The vegetable in her hand was just a piece of that broader world, neither villain nor savior, simply part of life's ongoing, quiet composition. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, another shocking revelation about food. She glanced at it, then put it aside. For once, she didn't feel the tug to react. Instead, she returned to her notebook, jotting down a reflection. Consistency matters more than urgency. The simple phrase felt like a quiet mantra. As evening approached, she prepared a small meal, including the vegetable she had handled so carefully. Each chop, each stir, was deliberate. She noticed the colors, the textures, the way aromas rose from the pan. Cooking, she realized, was not just sustenance, it was mindfulness in motion, a way of embedding care into daily life. Dinner was quiet, but in that quiet, she felt something shift. Not a sudden transformation, not a miracle, just a gentle affirmation. The ordinary actions, repeated and attended to, carried weight far beyond what headlines promised. She felt stronger, steadier, not because the vegetable was safe or dangerous, but because she had reclaimed her own perspective. Later, sitting on the porch swing with a cup of tea, she reflected on the day. The world remained loud with claims, risks, and overnight warnings, but she had discovered a quieter truth. Empowerment comes not from reacting to every alarm but from noticing, choosing, and nurturing consistency. Life, after all, is built not in moments of panic, but in decades of small, deliberate attention. And as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, she whispered to herself, almost a question, almost a promise, how often do we forget that the smallest, gentlest choices can shift everything? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? It felt almost sacred holding something so ordinary in my hands. She spoke the words softly, more to herself than anyone else, as the morning sun streamed through the kitchen window. The vegetable lay on the counter, unremarkable in shape, weight, and color. But in that moment, it carried the weight of all the stories, fears, and expectations that had surrounded it over the past weeks. The ordinary had become extraordinary not because it had changed, but because she had finally taken a moment to see it fully, without judgment, without panic. This story, like the chapters before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing, understanding, and finding calm amidst a world that constantly insists on urgency. She remembered how she had first come across the warnings. Headlines that screamed risk, shock, overnight. Each word seemed to magnify anxiety, turning an everyday object into a symbol of fear. But now, holding it, she realized the absurdity of the panic. The vegetable hadn't changed. The world hadn't changed. Only her perception had, shaped by attention, reflection, and the slow accumulation of understanding. According to many studies, the human mind responds to repetition and emphasis more than to immediate reality. Warnings repeated, dramatized, or sensationalized create a perception of danger that often exceeds the true risk. Meanwhile, calm, mindful observation, consistent habits, and gradual adjustment produce long-lasting, tangible benefits that are rarely reported in headlines. She thought back to decades of her own experience, of watching friends, neighbors, and family age gracefully. None of them had been saved or harmed by a single food, supplement, or quick fix. What mattered were patterns: walking after meals, stretching in the morning, taking time to laugh, eat, and rest. Health, she realized, was woven from countless tiny choices, not a single dramatic event. Later, she took a walk in the neighborhood, the air crisp, with early winter chill, leaves crunched underfoot, and a dog barked in the distance. She noticed her own pace, steady and unhurried. Her body felt alive, responsive, capable, not because she had avoided anything specific, but because she had cared for it consistently over time. What many people notice is that consistency compounds quietly. One extra glass of water here, one stretch there, a few mindful bites, instead of hurried meals. These are the threads that, when woven together, create resilience. They are not flashy. They do not generate headlines, but they endure. As she returned home, she prepared a simple meal, incorporating the vegetable without thought of risk or reward. Chopping, stirring, tasting, each motion felt deliberate, grounding. Cooking became a meditation, a gentle reminder that she was in control of her choices. Her attention mattered more than any alarmist story. After dinner, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, the sky painted in deep purples and golds. The day had been ordinary in many ways, yet in its quiet unfolding, she found a profound lesson. Empowerment is less about information and more about perspective. It's about noticing, adjusting, and nurturing oneself over time. The ordinary becomes extraordinary, not through panic, but through mindful care. She reflected on the weeks of worry, the snippets of news, the conversations with friends, and the internal chorus of doubt. Each moment had seemed urgent, dramatic, even threatening. But now, looking back, she saw them as fragments, pieces of a story that had gained weight only through repetition and attention. Life, she realized, was far more about measured observation than instantaneous reaction. Her thoughts drifted to her neighbors, to friends, to the younger self who had once believed that any warning demanded immediate compliance. How many hours had been spent worrying unnecessarily? How much energy had been diverted from the real work of living and nurturing? She smiled, softly, acknowledging the lessons without guilt. Growth is never wasted. Later that night, she placed the vegetable in the refrigerator, its presence no longer ominous but simply part of her routine. It had become, in a way, a symbol not of danger, but of attention, patience, and the quiet power of small, consistent choices. Before bed, she wrote in her journal, "Health is not about instant transformations. It is about noticing, adjusting, and honoring the small things day by day. The ordinary has power if we choose to see it." And as she turned off the lights, listening to the soft hum of the house settling into night, she felt a deep, abiding sense of balance. Not certainty, not triumph, just calm. A recognition that the patterns we nurture quietly, patiently, and consistently shape the trajectory of our lives, far more than the loud warnings we encounter along the way. And in that calm, she asked herself softly, almost rhetorically, how often do we overlook the small, gentle actions that truly shift everything? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I caught myself smiling at something so small, I almost felt guilty. It was mid-morning, sunlight pooling across the hardwood floors, and she had just poured herself a cup of tea. Outside, a neighbor's cat padded silently along the fence, tail flicking with deliberate curiosity. The moment was fleeting, almost trivial, yet it sparked a warmth inside her that she hadn't anticipated. Small joys, she realized, often arrived quietly, unannounced, and demanded recognition only if one chose to notice. This story, like all those before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing life's subtle patterns, cultivating awareness, and finding empowerment in small, deliberate actions. She sat at her kitchen table, the tea steaming gently in her hands, reflecting on how easily attention could be consumed by headlines and warnings. For weeks, she had tracked every news alert, every dramatic claim about food and health, every story implying that life could change overnight. And yet, here she was, noticing the way light fell across the table, the gentle aroma of chamomile, the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. Reality, she understood, was far richer and far gentler than the stories that demanded immediate alarm. According to many studies, mindfulness and the ability to savor small moments correlate strongly with both physical and emotional well-being, particularly as people age. The act of noticing a bird landing, a child laughing, a scent does more than bring fleeting happiness. It tunes the nervous system, improves mood, and fosters resilience. In other words, paying attention to the ordinary is itself a form of health. She thought about the past few years, the gradual accumulation of habits and routines. Morning walks, short stretches before breakfast, a few moments of journaling each day. None of these actions had been dramatic. None had been urgent. Yet, together, they had created a foundation, a rhythm that supported her energy, mood, and sense of self. She understood now that life wasn't built in leaps. It was built in the spaces between, in repeated attention to what might seem inconsequential. What many people notice over time is that small, consistent practices compound. One extra glass of water, a brief walk around the block, a mindful bite instead of a rushed mouthful. All of these tiny interventions accumulate to create meaningful change. They are not flashy. They are rarely celebrated, but they are enduring. Later, she ventured outside for a short walk. The air was crisp, the leaves beginning their slow descent from branches into golden carpets along the sidewalks. Each step felt deliberate, grounding her in the rhythm of her body and the world around her. She observed the neighbors tending gardens, children playing tag across driveways, and the occasional car passing with no destination but routine. The ordinary, she realized, was alive with lessons if one took the time to notice. Returning home, she prepared a small lunch, including the same vegetable that had caused weeks of concern. This time, the act of cooking was calm, mindful, and even joyful. She chopped and stirred, noting texture and aroma, appreciating the nourishment she was preparing. Cooking became meditation, reflection, and care, all in one, proof that small actions could carry profound significance. As she ate, she thought about the stories she had internalized, the fear they sometimes generated, and the realization that she had choice. She could respond to anxiety and urgency, or she could respond with attention, care, and deliberate action. The difference was subtle but transformative. The same vegetable, the same habits, the same world, but the experience had shifted entirely. In the quiet afternoon, she opened her journal and began writing. Not plans, not resolutions, not rules, but reflections, observations, gratitude for the small moments she might otherwise have overlooked. She noted the feeling of warmth from the sun on her skin, the satisfaction of a meal prepared with care, the ease of movement in her limbs. Each observation was a thread, weaving a fabric of attention and resilience, and as dusk approached, painting the sky in muted purples and golds, she paused in the doorway to watch the world settle. The cat had returned to its perch, leaves rustled gently in the wind, and the quiet of the neighborhood pressed softly against her awareness. She understood that life's most meaningful shifts rarely announced themselves with fanfare. They arrived in whispers, in small choices, in repeated attention to ordinary details that accumulate into lasting well-being. Finally, she sat back with her tea, reflecting on how easily one could mistake noise for signal. Headlines had their place, but they were not the only narrative. Life's quiet, consistent patterns were often the most profound teachers. She smiled, recognizing the subtle shift within herself, the ability to see, notice, and act with calm discernment. And as night fell, she whispered softly to herself, a question that felt more like an invitation than a challenge. How often do we overlook the small, gentle actions that truly shift everything? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I realized I'd been holding my breath all morning. The thought struck her suddenly, as if it had been quietly accumulating under the surface, unnoticed until that moment. She was standing by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, sunlight painting the walls in soft stripes. Outside, the autumn leaves swirled lazily in the breeze, each one carried on a trajectory set long before it caught her attention. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension she hadn't realized she was holding melt into the morning air. This story, like all before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing what often goes unnoticed, about finding calm and empowerment in the ordinary patterns of life rather than in dramatic warnings. For weeks, the news had been relentless. Each headline promised urgency, shock, a life-altering revelation. This vegetable could change everything overnight. She had read, skimmed, and fretted. But now, standing there, she felt how disconnected those stories had been from the rhythm of her own life. The real shifts, the ones that mattered, had always been subtle, quiet, incremental. According to many studies, chronic stress can influence both physical and mental well-being far more than isolated dietary choices. Small, repeated patterns, deep breaths, regular movement, adequate rest, have measurable effects on resilience, energy, and mood. The body, much like a finely tuned instrument, responds not to single events but to sustained thoughtful care. She thought about the walks she had taken over the past months, the stretches before breakfast, the mindful meals, where she truly tasted and savored each bite. None of these were dramatic interventions, none promised instant results. Yet, together, they had shifted her awareness, her energy, and even her emotional stability. What had once been subtle anxiety about risk now seemed like background noise, easily acknowledged but no longer dominating her perception. What many people notice is that true transformation doesn't arrive in headlines. It arrives in daily moments, the way the body responds to a gentle stretch, the mental clarity that comes after a short walk, the satisfaction of preparing a simple meal with attention and care. Life compounds these small actions in ways that are profound precisely because they are gradual. Later that morning, she prepared a light breakfast, including the vegetable that had been vilified. As she chopped it, she noticed its color, its texture, the way light reflected off its surface. The act was mundane, yet intentional. She stirred it into a simple sauté, seasoning slowly, tasting as she went. Cooking had become more than sustenance, it was mindfulness in motion, a way to honor her body and her choices. After breakfast, she went outside for a walk. The neighborhood was alive with subtle movements, the distant barking of a dog, the soft chatter of children, the rustle of leaves along the sidewalks. She matched her steps to her breath, noticing the cadence of her limbs, the gentle sway of her arms, the rhythm that reminded her that her body was capable, responsive, and resilient. The Spana station work. The Mac data for Mana starred in the summaries. The Maction work date were the Fesson, were salve, responsive, and description. The Maction date. There was no drama, no overnight reversal, just life unfolding, moment by moment. She reflected on how easily she had been drawn into fear-based narratives. It was tempting to believe that any single event could dictate the course of her health. Yet every day spent worrying about instantaneous change had distracted from the accumulation of mindful, intentional habits. She realized now that power lay not in avoiding or fearing, but in observing, responding, and nurturing consistency. YLang 17 YL so, YLang 17 YL 0, with a nurturing to 16, YL 17 YL 0, YLang 17 17 YL 0, YLang 17 YL 0, YLang 17 17 YL. Later, she wrote in her journal, noting observations rather than judgments. She recorded the feel of the air, the warmth of the sun, the satisfaction of a meal, and the sense of calm that had replaced anxiety. Each entry was a quiet reinforcement, a recognition that life's shifts often take root in the mundane, unnoticed until reflection reveals their impact. By evening, she felt a renewed sense of balance. The world outside remained full of urgent claims and alarming headlines, but she no longer felt compelled to react to each one. Her body and mind were tuned to subtler signals, to the gradual accumulation of care and attention. She understood now that empowerment was not dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly effective over time. As night settled and stars began to appear, she sipped her tea and gazed out the window. The small, gentle patterns she had cultivated, the walks, the mindful cooking, the deliberate pauses, had shifted her experience of life. The fear that once seemed overwhelming now felt distant, almost absurd. The ordinary, she realized, carried far more power than she had ever acknowledged. And as she closed her journal, she whispered to herself, softly, thoughtfully, how often do we underestimate the cumulative effect of small, mindful choices on the quality of our lives? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I felt a flutter of surprise at how quiet the house was. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun had just slipped behind a cluster of trees, casting dappled shadows across the kitchen floor. She was alone, or almost alone, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards, the only reminders of life continuing in its gentle, ordinary rhythm. For the first time in weeks, she realized she could breathe without urgency, without the persistent tension that had followed the relentless news cycles. This story, like the ones before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing life's subtle rhythms and finding power in the ordinary, in consistent, mindful action rather than in dramatic warnings or instant solutions. She paused at the counter, letting her hands rest on the edge, feeling the grain of the wood. The vegetable, that had been the center of so much concern, sat nearby, unassuming and unchanged. Its presence was no longer threatening. It was simply part of the day. The contrast struck her sharply. Weeks of worry had been focused on something so ordinary, yet the real shift had come not from avoiding it, but from noticing her own patterns, her own choices, her own capacity to act with calm intention. According to many studies, the cumulative effects of small, consistent actions like walking, stretching, mindful eating, and gentle reflection often have more measurable impact on health and well-being than any single intervention. These actions may not make headlines, but they shape resilience, mood, and energy in profound ways over time. She thought about the mornings she had spent quietly journaling, recording observations of her energy, her habits, and her environment. At first, it had felt tedious, even pointless, but gradually, patterns had emerged. She noticed that on days she moved her body gently in the morning, she felt steadier by afternoon. When she ate deliberately, savoring each bite instead of rushing, her mood lifted slightly. Even small, repeated actions, chores done mindfully, a short walk to the mailbox, a few moments of deep breathing added up. They weren't dramatic, they weren't immediate, but they were tangible. What many people notice is that this slow accumulation of care is often invisible until reflection makes it clear. A week, a month, a year of consistent, mindful attention to ordinary actions can transform energy, emotional balance, and resilience in ways that dramatic warnings or quick fixes never will. Later, she set about preparing a simple lunch, incorporating the vegetable once again. She chopped and stirred, paying attention to color, texture, and aroma. Each motion was deliberate, a meditation on the ordinary act of nourishment. Cooking had become a ritual of presence, a way to anchor herself in reality rather than the constant cycle of fear-based messaging. Afterward, she went outside for a slow walk. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves, damp soil, and distant rain. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their movement deliberate yet effortless. Her steps matched her breathing, each inhale and exhale creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the quiet cadence of life itself. There was no urgency here, no drama, no overnight stakes, just the gentle affirmation that life continues, and that attention to small choices matters. She thought of her friends and neighbors, many of whom had also been drawn into the cycle of worry over sensationalized stories. They had shared recipes, tips, anecdotes, and warnings with one another, often more in anxiety than in certainty. She realized that part of her own empowerment had come from stepping back, acknowledging the information without being swept away by it, noticing patterns without demanding perfection, embracing the ordinary as powerful. As evening approached, she returned home, feeling a quiet satisfaction that was entirely different from the relief that follows dramatic news. It was steady, durable, a sense of self-trust, rooted in attention and care. She prepared her dinner slowly, appreciating each bite, noting subtle flavors, textures, and aromas. Life felt fuller, richer, more vibrant, not because danger had disappeared, but because she had discovered the power of consistent, mindful engagement with her own world. Later, as the house settled into night, she sat by the window with her journal. She wrote about the day, the sunlight across the floor, the soft wind outside, the satisfaction of movement and nourishment. Each detail was small, ordinary, seemingly inconsequential, but together they formed a quiet testament to the way life changes through deliberate, attentive action. And as she closed her journal, she reflected on the pattern that had emerged over weeks of small, consistent choices. The ordinary, attended to with care, carries more power than the extraordinary, announced with urgency. She realized, finally, that transformation is rarely instant. It is quiet, incremental, and often unnoticed, until reflection reveals its depth. She smiled softly, thinking how life, like the vegetable on her counter, is rarely dramatic. Yet through small, mindful actions, it can be remarkably resilient, rich, and sustaining. Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the tension I'd been carrying. It was early morning, and the house was filled with a quiet stillness. The light from the rising sun filtered through thin curtains, painting the kitchen in soft amber hues. She paused mid-step, momentarily staring at her reflection in the stainless steel of the refrigerator. Lines she had grown accustomed to seemed softened, her posture less rigid, her expression calmer. For weeks, she had carried a subtle but persistent weight, an anxiety sparked by headlines, by warnings, by the constant pressure of doing everything right. And now, in the mirror's reflection, she realized that small, consistent habits had begun to shift something more profound than just her body. They had altered her very presence. This story, like those before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing how mindful, deliberate choices accumulate quietly over time, shaping well-being and resilience in ways that headlines rarely capture. She thought about the past month. Mornings spent journaling, short walks around the neighborhood, stretches that woke her muscles gently, mindful meals that encouraged attention rather than speed. Each action had seemed minor in isolation, sometimes even tedious. But together they had produced subtle changes that were only now coming into full awareness. According to many studies, habits, especially small, consistent ones, compound over time, influencing both mental and physical health more reliably than occasional dramatic interventions. One gentle walk each day, a few minutes of deep breathing, choosing nourishment over convenience. These actions form the foundation of energy, balance, and emotional stability. They may not yield instant results, but their cumulative effects are profound. She recalled the first few mornings of her journaling practice, when she had struggled to notice anything beyond the noise of headlines and obligations. At first, it had felt like a small, almost meaningless act, jotting down thoughts, logging meals, noting energy levels. But over weeks, patterns emerged. She began to see the cause and effect relationship between small, mindful behaviors and her sense of balance and vitality. The mundane became meaningful. What many people notice over time is that life's most transformative shifts are subtle. A brief stretch, a slow walk, a moment of presence. These small acts create ripples that touch energy, mood, and even social interactions. They are often invisible to the outside world but deeply felt internally. Later, she prepared breakfast, including the same vegetable that had prompted so much anxiety. She handled it without hesitation, chopping it with calm attention, noticing the way light reflected off its surface and the subtle aroma that rose from it. Cooking had become more than a routine. It was a meditation, a practice of presence and care. Every stir of the pan, every bite taken slowly, became a reinforcement of agency, proof that she could nurture herself regardless of external alarms. After breakfast, she went for a walk, noticing the crispness of the air, the gentle sway of tree branches, the sound of her footsteps against the pavement. Each breath, each step, became an exercise in attentiveness, anchoring her to the present moment rather than the frenzy of fear and speculation that had previously dominated her thoughts. Life, she realized, was less about avoiding risk and more about cultivating steady, thoughtful engagement with her own body and mind. She reflected on her friends and neighbors, many of whom were caught in cycles of worry and reaction. The urge to follow every headline, every warning, was strong, especially in a world that amplified fear. But she understood now that true empowerment comes from pausing, noticing, and acting intentionally. The ordinary, when attended to with care, carries far more weight than the dramatic and urgent. By afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with her journal, recording observations rather than judgments. She noted how her body felt, how energy flowed through her limbs, the subtle lightness in her mind. Each observation reinforced the awareness that consistent, deliberate actions, however small, were gradually reshaping her experience of life. As evening approached, she prepared a simple dinner, savoring the process and the flavors. She felt a steady confidence, not arrogance, but a calm knowledge that she had begun to reclaim her perception from sensationalized narratives. The vegetable, once a source of anxiety, was now simply part of nourishment and daily ritual. Later, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, she watched the world transition from day to night. Streetlights flickered on, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the soft sounds of life persisted outside. She realized that resilience, vitality, and calm are not dramatic, headline-worthy outcomes. They are the accumulation of small, mindful choices, repeated with attention and care over weeks, months, and years. And as she closed her journal and leaned back in her chair, she whispered, softly, almost to herself, "How often do we overlook the subtle actions that shape who we become and how we move through the world? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything?" I noticed the faint hum of the refrigerator and realized how still everything had become. The quiet settled around her like a soft blanket, filling the kitchen with a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in weeks. Sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, casting a lattice of shadows across the counter where the vegetable she had been wary of sat. She reached out, touching it lightly, almost reverently. The moment was ordinary, mundane even, yet it carried a significance she hadn't expected. The quiet triumph of awareness over anxiety. This story, like the ones before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing life's subtle rhythms, embracing small, consistent habits, and understanding that empowerment often grows quietly in the ordinary spaces of daily life. She remembered how easily she had been caught up in fear. Weeks ago, the headlines had screamed urgency and overnight risk. She had read each one, felt the tension coil in her chest, and allowed worry to dictate choices. But over time, a subtle shift had begun. By focusing on small, deliberate actions, walking, stretching, journaling, mindful meals, she had reclaimed a sense of agency and calm. The vegetable on the counter, once a symbol of alarm, was now simply part of the daily routine. According to many studies, the accumulation of mindful habits, consistent movement, deliberate attention to nutrition, journaling, thoughts, and small moments of reflection affects both mental and physical health far more than occasional dramatic interventions. The body and mind respond to steady patterns rather than sudden changes, and resilience is cultivated through repetition, not urgency. She recalled the morning walks she had taken, the crisp air filling her lungs, the rhythmic motion of her steps. At first, it had felt mundane, almost insignificant, but over time, she noticed subtle differences: a steadier gait, lighter mood, greater awareness of her surroundings. It was a quiet transformation, invisible to anyone else, but deeply felt within. What many people notice is that change often comes not in bursts, but in incremental shifts. A single stretch, a brief walk, or a mindful meal may seem inconsequential, yet, compounded over weeks and months, these small choices reshape energy, mood, and perspective. They are the quiet architects of transformation. Later that morning, she prepared breakfast with deliberate care. The vegetable, once the source of so much worry, became an object of observation rather than fear. She noticed its color, its texture, the subtle aroma as it cooked. Cooking had evolved into an act of mindfulness, a ritual that grounded her in the present and reinforced her own agency. Every chop, stir, and taste was a gentle reminder that she could choose attention and care over anxiety and reaction. After breakfast, she stepped outside for a walk through her neighborhood. The air was crisp, and leaves rustled beneath her feet. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby yard, and the distant hum of traffic reminded her of the broader rhythm of life. She matched her breath to her steps, allowing each inhale and exhale to anchor her to the present. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about headlines, risks, or alarms. She was simply moving, noticing, and participating fully in the ordinary flow of life. She reflected on friends who had shared their own anxieties and stories of caution. She had once felt compelled to react, to mirror their worry, but now she recognized that empowerment came from stepping back, observing, and making deliberate choices. The ordinary, when attended to with care, held far more transformative power than the dramatic and urgent. By afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with her journal, capturing observations rather than judgments. She noted the way her body felt, how her mind responded to subtle movement, the satisfaction of a meal prepared with attention, and the quiet rhythm of her surroundings. Each entry reinforced the understanding that transformation often occurs in the spaces between urgency, in the repetition of mindful choices rather than in singular dramatic acts. As evening approached, she prepared a simple dinner, savoring each bite and noticing flavors, textures, and aromas. The vegetable, once feared, was now simply nourishment. Its significance had shifted not because it had changed, but because she had changed through consistent attention, observation, and care. Later, with a cup of tea in hand, she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The world outside remained in motion, leaves falling, cars passing, life continuing, yet she felt a deep sense of balance. Empowerment, she realized, was rarely sudden or dramatic. It was cultivated quietly, day by day, in ordinary actions repeated with mindfulness and intention. And as the house settled into night, she whispered softly, reflecting on the subtle power of attention and consistency. How often do we underestimate the quiet, repeated choices that truly shape who we are and how we experience life? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I paused mid-step, realizing I had been rushing through the entire morning. Description: the sunlight slanted through the blinds in long, golden streaks, warming the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. She had been moving mechanically, pouring coffee, grabbing the newspaper, checking messages, but suddenly, in that moment, she noticed the rhythm of her own breath. It was shallow, hurried, and tense, reflecting weeks of subtle anxiety she hadn't fully acknowledged. She stopped, set her cup down, and let herself exhale slowly, deeply, deliberately. The difference was immediate. A quiet calm spread through her chest, an awareness of being fully present for the first time that morning. This story, like all the chapters before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing patterns, reclaiming attention, and finding empowerment in small, mindful choices that accumulate over time. For weeks, she had been caught in cycles of concern about news headlines. Every alert seemed urgent, risk, overnight, unexpected. She had followed them, internalized them, allowed her body and mind to respond with subtle tension and worry. Yet in moments like this, when she paused and breathed, she realized that the headlines had no power over her unless she allowed them to. True agency came from presence, observation, and consistent, gentle actions that reinforced well-being. According to many studies, mindful pauses, deliberate breathing, and consistent small habits can significantly improve both mental and physical health. These interventions may seem minor in isolation: a short walk, a few deep breaths, a mindful meal, but compounded over time, they shape energy, resilience, and emotional equilibrium more reliably than any dramatic, instantaneous solution. She remembered the past few months, journaling in the quiet mornings, mindful stretching routines, slowly savoring meals rather than rushing through them. Each act, though small, had created a subtle but profound shift in her experience of life. It was invisible to the outside observer, yet she could feel it in the ease of movement, in the steadiness of her mood, in the gentle clarity of thought that emerged after moments of attention. What many people notice is that transformation is rarely sudden. It grows quietly, like roots beneath the surface of a tree, unseen until a branch reaches the light. Small, repeated choices, pausing before action, noticing the body, engaging in intentional movement, accumulate into resilience, energy, and a sense of groundedness that headlines and fear cannot replicate. Later that morning, she prepared a simple breakfast, including the vegetable that had once triggered weeks of anxiety. She handled it with calm, deliberate attention, noting color, texture, and aroma. Cooking became an act of mindfulness, a ritual that allowed her to reclaim agency over her choices. Each chop, stir, and taste reinforced a powerful realization. Empowerment is not about avoiding risk. It is about choosing presence, care, and thoughtful action. After breakfast, she took a walk through her neighborhood. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and birds flitted from branch to branch, moving without urgency, but with intent. Her steps matched her breath, creating a rhythm that grounded her in the moment. There were no sudden revelations, no dramatic transformations, just the quiet unfolding of life, observed and engaged with fully. She reflected on friends and neighbors who often shared their anxieties, discussing the latest warnings and sensational stories. She had once mirrored their concern, allowing it to dictate her choices, but now she understood a crucial distinction. Information is useful, but empowerment comes from how one responds. The ordinary, approached with attention and care, has far more transformative power than drama ever could. By afternoon, she sat with her journal, recording her observations. She noted how her body felt, how her breath and steps influenced her mood, and the satisfaction of meals prepared mindfully. Each observation reinforced the quiet truth she had been learning. Life changes in subtle, cumulative ways, and transformation is built in the spaces between dramatic events, in the small, consistent choices made every day. As evening approached, she prepared a gentle dinner, savoring the process and flavors. The vegetable, once the source of alarm, had become nourishment, an object of routine and attention. Its significance had shifted entirely because she had shifted through consistent mindfulness, reflection, and presence. Later, with the soft hum of the house around her and a cup of tea in hand, she watched the sun dip low, the sky painted with gentle oranges and purples. She reflected on the quiet, patient power of small, repeated actions, the walks, the stretches, the mindful eating, the pauses, the breath. Each choice had accumulated, gradually shaping her experience of life, her energy, her sense of calm. And, as she closed her journal, she whispered softly to herself, a question that had come to define her recent weeks. How often do we underestimate the subtle, repeated habits that truly transform how we feel, think, and live? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I paused, hearing the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, and realized I had been moving through life half awake. It was late morning, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen window in long, warm slats. She stood holding her cup of tea, noticing for the first time in weeks the faint scent of cinnamon from yesterday's baking lingering in the air. The moment felt suspended, quiet, yet full, and she realized how much of her life had been a blur of routines and worry, punctuated by news alerts and dramatic warnings. This pause, simple and ordinary, felt revolutionary. She inhaled deeply, savoring the warmth of the cup in her hands and the calm that had finally seeped into her chest. This story, like all the ones before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about noticing life's subtle patterns, reclaiming attention, and understanding that consistent, mindful actions, no matter how small, can cultivate resilience and empowerment over time. For weeks, she had felt the quiet tension of living under constant headlines. The vegetable that supposedly carried overnight risk had dominated her thoughts, yet she had slowly learned that true change was rarely abrupt. Instead, it emerged in small, deliberate acts: walking, journaling, stretching, mindful meals. Each moment of presence created a foundation, a steady rhythm that no headline could disrupt. According to many studies, small, consistent interventions like mindful breathing, gentle movement, and paying attention to nutrition have measurable effects on both mental and physical health. The body responds not to dramatic, sudden actions but to sustained, intentional behaviors. By embedding these small habits into daily life, energy stabilizes, mood improves, and resilience grows. She reflected on her morning walks. At first, they had seemed trivial, just a few minutes of movement each day, but gradually she noticed subtle differences. Her posture felt steadier, her steps lighter, her mind clearer. The quiet rhythms of nature, the wind in the trees, the distant chatter of neighbors, the soft rustling of leaves underfoot became her teachers. They reminded her that life's most significant shifts are rarely sudden. They arrive gently, quietly, and only reveal their impact when one pauses to notice. What many people notice over time is that consistency outweighs intensity. A single dramatic act, avoiding a food, following an extreme routine, chasing quick fixes might feel urgent but rarely yields lasting results. By contrast, small, repeated actions, chosen consciously and practiced consistently, shape well-being, mood, and even cognitive clarity. Later, she prepared a simple lunch. The vegetable she had once feared now rested calmly on her cutting board, its color bright, its texture unassuming. She chopped it mindfully, appreciating the sound and feel of each slice, inhaled its faint aroma, and stirred it gently in a skillet. Cooking had become an act of presence, a meditation that reminded her she could nurture herself without succumbing to fear. Each bite reinforced the realization that empowerment comes from deliberate, consistent attention, not dramatic avoidance or panic. After lunch, she walked slowly through her garden, feeling the soil beneath her fingers and noticing the subtle growth of plants even as autumn approached. Each step, each breath, was a reminder that life unfolds in gradual, meaningful ways. The ordinary rhythms of movement, nourishment, and observation, though seemingly insignificant, accumulated to create energy, resilience, and peace. She thought about friends who had shared their anxieties, discussing risks and sensational claims with intensity. She had once mirrored their concern. But now, she recognized a crucial truth. Empowerment comes not from reacting to fear, but from noticing patterns, choosing intentional habits, and observing their effects. Ordinary acts, repeated with care, have more power to shift experience than the most urgent headline. By evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her journal, recording observations rather than judgments. She wrote about the warmth of the sun, the feel of her breath, the satisfaction of movement, and the simple pleasure of a meal prepared with attention. These notes became a quiet testament to her growing awareness. Life's most transformative shifts arise from repeated, mindful choices, not from dramatic interventions or sudden solutions. As night fell, she watched the stars appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. She sipped her tea and reflected on the subtle, patient power of small, consistent actions. The walks, the stretches, the mindful meals, the journaling, the pauses. Each choice had accumulated, gradually reshaping her sense of self, her energy, and her perception of life. The vegetable on her plate, once a source of fear, had become a symbol of conscious, empowered living, and as she closed her journal and leaned back in her chair, she whispered softly to herself, realizing the quiet truth that had emerged over weeks of intentional living. How often do we overlook the small, repeated choices that ultimately define the way we feel, move, and live? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything? I watched the first snowflakes drift past the window, feeling the hush of the world settle in. It was late afternoon, and the sky was a soft, smoky gray, the kind of color that makes everything else, buildings, trees, streets, seem more vivid by contrast. She leaned against the kitchen counter, a cup of warm tea cradled in her hands, and noticed the faint curl of steam rising into the air. Outside, the snow fell slowly, lightly, each flake unique, delicate, yet part of a vast, inevitable pattern. The quiet beauty of it mirrored the shift she had been cultivating for weeks, subtle, cumulative, and profound. This story, like all the chapters before it, is meant to inform and inspire, not to provide medical advice. It is about the power of ordinary, consistent choices and the quiet transformation that unfolds when we pay attention to the rhythms of daily life, rather than chasing headlines or reacting to fear. She thought back over the journey of the past months, the mornings of mindful breathing, the short walks, the meals prepared slowly and attentively, the journaling of small observations, the pauses before reacting. Each action had seemed minor in isolation, even mundane, yet together they had created a profound shift in her energy, resilience, and sense of presence. She realized that true transformation doesn't announce itself with urgency, it grows quietly, unnoticed until reflection reveals its impact. According to many studies, cumulative habits, small, repeated acts of movement, mindfulness, and deliberate attention to nutrition, shape both physical and mental well-being, far more effectively than sudden, dramatic interventions. The body responds to consistency, and the mind thrives on routine that balances attention with gentle curiosity. She recalled her morning walks through the neighborhood, where the crisp air, rustling leaves, and distant laughter became her teachers. Each step, each inhalation, each simple observation reinforced a quiet truth. Life changes in subtle, incremental ways. Just as snowflakes accumulate to blanket the ground, small habits accumulate to shape energy, mood, and overall well-being. Later, she prepared a simple dinner, incorporating the vegetable that had once been a source of anxiety. She chopped it carefully, noting its color, texture, and aroma, stirring it into a warm sauté. Cooking had become an act of mindfulness, a ritual that grounded her in the present and reminded her that she had agency over her choices. Each bite was a meditation, a reinforcement of the idea that empowerment comes from consistency, observation, and gentle care. After dinner, she stepped outside briefly, letting the cold air kiss her cheeks and watching snowflakes land softly on the garden beds. She noticed the rhythm of her breath, the steady strength in her legs, and the calm in her chest. Life, she understood, is rarely about dramatic interventions or instantaneous solutions. It is about showing up for oneself consistently, choosing awareness over reaction, presence over panic, and nurturing ordinary habits that quietly compound into resilience. She thought of friends and neighbors who had remained caught in cycles of worry, reacting to sensationalized headlines. She had once been there too, but now she recognized a subtle yet powerful difference. Freedom comes not from avoidance, but from attention and action. By engaging fully with ordinary routines, she had reclaimed a sense of agency and calm that no external alarm could disturb. As night fell and snow blanketed the neighborhood in silence, she returned to her journal. She wrote down the simple observations of her day, the taste of the meal, the feel of the air, the quiet joy of movement, the beauty of snowflakes settling on the ground. These notes were a testament to the quiet accumulation of mindful choices, a record of how small actions, repeated with attention, can gradually transform life from the inside out. Sitting by the window, tea in hand, she reflected on the subtle, patient power of consistent attention. The walks, the mindful cooking, the journaling, the pauses, the deep breaths, each had accumulated to reshape her body, mind, and spirit. The vegetable, once a source of fear, was now simply nourishment, a symbol of intentional, empowered living. The snow outside mirrored her own transformation, quiet, gentle, gradual, yet undeniable in its effect. She smiled softly, thinking about the journey she had undertaken. The lesson was clear. True change is not dramatic, not instantaneous, but it is profound when cultivated patiently, mindfully, and consistently. The ordinary, attended to with care, has the power to shift everything. And as she set her journal aside and watched the last snowflakes drift past, she whispered to herself with quiet conviction, "How often do we overlook the subtle choices that, over time, redefine who we are and how we experience life? Have you ever noticed how small changes sometimes shift everything?"